Mixing tip number 1 is to stay organized with your groups and buses. I remember back in a day when I would have like 30 or 40 or 50 tracks in a mix, and I wouldn't group them together. I would have them as individual tracks, all running into the stereo output of the mix or into the master bus. Whenever I wanted to tweak something, I was unsure of where the nasty sounds came from. So it was really hard to mix. And then I was wondering, how do the pros do it? Because they seem to find mixing really easy. How can I feel that? And when I read magazines and read books and watch tutorials where people have 60 or 70 individual tracks in a mix, how is it possible? The solution is to group all the relevant tracks into buses. So you have, for example, all the drum sounds, you group those into one bus. You have all the bass sounds, you group them into one bus. Then you have all instruments, and then you have all vocals. Separate buses, a separate effects bus. It's sort of like a hierarchy where at the top you have the master bus. Under that you have the main buses for vocals and instruments. And then you have buses for drums, bass, instruments, vocals, effects. Maybe you have sub buses. You have grouped together a couple of snares. You have grouped together a couple of kicks and so on. And then you have the individual tracks, which may be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, depending on the size of the production. And when you have all that in place, you can just tweak the individual buses instead of tweaking, for example, the individual vocal tracks. And then you can mix in sequence so that you have a more tidy setup. And it's faster, it's easier to see what needs to be done. It's easier to isolate the problems that occurs when mixing, and you will have a better life in general. My life became way better after I found out about the grouping and the busing. And if you want a really fast way to get a clean mix, download my mixing templates for Logic Pro. They're free. There's 6 of them, and some are with plugins, some are without plugins. It will really give you an idea of how to think when it comes to grouping and busing. Go download it straight away, subphotic.com/logic. Now let's continue. The second mixing tip is mixing without plugins. I remember when I was starting out, I just slammed plugins upon plugins upon plugins. I was using Reason back then, so I would insert the M-class compressor, and then I would insert another compressor, and I was watching tutorials, reading about serial compression and multiband compression and parallel, and I wanted to try out all the tips. I ended up wrecking each and every mix that I was doing. My own songs became muffled and lifeless. What I did at some point, I just backtracked, and here's the tip. Mix without plugins, meaning get as good a sound as possible without using any processors. So you can't use any EQ, compression, nothing. No filters, not anything. Just use the faders and the pan pots. That's it. And that way you create a static mix, and then you can move on automating the faders. Maybe you can insert a gain plugin and just automate the gain of the tracks, and then you can just get some movement going on still without no plugins running. And then when you're all set, you can start with the plugins, of course, but that's a really good technique on just getting everything as good as possible from the get-go. That's mixing tip number 2. And let me know in the comments if you can relate to any of this. Have you also been there, or are you there currently? Let me know. Mixing tip number 3 is to mix into a compressor or limiter, and preferably both. I like to have some compression going on from the get-go. I usually first set up my static mix so everything sounds as good as possible without plugins. Now the first thing that I would do is to insert a bus compressor and a limiter on the final master chain or the mix bus. So like this, as you can see here. I will start tweaking the compressor to shape the sound as much as possible, to make the mix a bit more put together, to make it sound like a whole song, just slightly, not too much, of course. And then I would have the limiter going all the way to the top. I have -1 of output gain, and then I just max it out. And then I actually like to turn down the output gain, for example, by -4 or -5, and I just let it be there. And then I know that I have sufficient headroom. Now, if you happen to like this video so far, hit the like button. Consider subscribing if you like more videos like these. And also let me know in the comments, which of these mixing tips do you like the most? Let me know. Mixing tip number 4 is to not be afraid of automation. Automate as much as you can. Starting out, I found it intimidating and quite overwhelming to look at all the parameters you could tweak using automation. And you can look at this. It's a mess. So at some point, I started carefully doing the volume automation, carefully with some filter automation, and then I became more accustomed to doing it. And then after a while, I challenged myself to automate as many tracks in the mix as possible, including the mix bus. So I just had to get over that. It was sort of like a bump in a road that I just had to overcome. And then at the other side of that, I had dynamic and powerful and punchy mixes, which I didn't have before, because before my mixes were more stale and vanilla. It doesn't have to be big changes in the mix. It doesn't have to be major dips and peaks. Oftentimes you can just barely hear it, but most of all feel it. And if you want to learn more about automation, I have this great video here about automation that you can check out right now or later if you want to. And mixing tip number 5 is to replace your EQ with an exciter or a saturator. When I first learned the Pultec trick, you can use it both on the low end and on the high end. I had a lot of fun experimenting with that, and I found that oftentimes I would wreck the mix. I would make vocals that were too bright, too harsh. I would introduce too much muddiness in the low end, too much bass that was eating up the vocals and everything. So it was a mess. So I started experimenting with multiband compression and just turning up the sound of the high bands on the compressor and compressing that so that, yes, I was increasing the gain in the high end, for example, 10 kilohertz and up, but I would also compress it so that all the harshness would be tamed. And likewise with the bass, I could increase the overall volume of the bass by increasing the gain, but then I would compress it so all the dynamic peaks were clamped down upon. So you had this tight, loud bass, but with everything else intact. And you can also use saturators, such as the free plugin called Fresh Air by Slate Digital. It's not a sponsored video, but the link is in the description anyways, because I like it. And then you have the FabFilter Saturn, which is a multiband saturator. I like that very much. So you can increase the level or the gain on the high end. Instead of with a multiband compressor compress it, you can saturate it. And I want to give a big shout out to It's Me Design on Instagram, who pointed me in the direction of this technique right here. I've been using it ever since, actually, for this one. So big shout out to you. I love your content. I've linked them in the description. You should check him out. And don't forget to download my free pack of 6 Logic Pro templates. The link is in the description, subphotic.com/logic. And if you want more tip videos like these, check out one of these 2 videos. Thank you so much for watching. Hope I see you in one of these. Peace!